Anabaptists. The Reformation called forth a new upsurge of socialist movements. Even in pre-Reformation times, Germany was full of chiliastic sentiment. Wandering preachers exposed the sins of the world and foretold the forthcoming vengeance. Astrological predictions of calamity were common: famine, rebellion, when the rivers will flow with blood, and there was a saying, who does not die in 1523, is not drowned in 1524, is not killed in 1525, shall say that a miracle has happened to him. The invention of printing enormously magnified the effect of these ideas. Any peasant or artisan could be exposed to leaflets showing a peasant army marching toward the future revolution, with a frightened pope, princes, and prelates fleeing before it. This sentiment was given especially strong expression in the Anabaptist movement, which spread to Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Czechia, Denmark, and Holland, and which, in the following century, spilled over into England. The sect's name, as so often happened, was given to it by its enemies. It seems that the term was coined by Zwingli. The movement as such had existed long before, its members calling each other brother. The designation Anabaptist, the rebaptized, is to be explained by the fact that the sect refused to recognize the baptism of children and often performed a second baptism of adults. In later times, members of this sect came to call themselves Baptists. Basically, the doctrine of the Anabaptists derived from the notion, already familiar to us, of the falling away of the Catholic Church, in Emperor Constantine's time, from the true teachings of Christ. These sectarians considered themselves direct successors of the Christianity of apostolic times. They denied the entire tradition of the Catholic Church, that is, every aspect of its doctrine and organization not specifically identified in the Gospels. They refused to recognize the supreme authority of the Pope, believed that salvation of the soul was possible outside the Church, and professed a universal priesthood. Of the Scriptures, they recognize only the Gospels as sacred and only the words spoken by Christ himself, at that. The Sermon on the Mount had particular significance for them, and they believed that its commandments should be observed to the letter. According to their doctrine, the meaning of the Gospels is revealed through inspiration to anyone worthy of it, now just as in apostolic times. Anabaptists believed murder to be a cardinal sin under any circumstances and rejected oaths of any kind. For this reason, they refused to participate in many aspects of life. In general, the opposition of true Christians to the world of false Christians played a large role in their teachings. This led at critical periods to militant appeals for extermination of the impious. In organization, the Anabaptists largely resembled the Cathars. The movement was guided entirely by a society of apostles who, having renounced marriage and property, led the life of pilgrims. They wandered in pairs, the older apostle devoting himself to matters of faith and the sect's organization, with the younger apostle helping him with practical matters. The apostles elected bishops from among their own ranks, the latter guiding the activity of the sect in various regions. Councils of bishops, synods, or capituli, were convened to discuss questions of principle. For example, in his invitation to the synod at Waldshut in 1524, Balthasar Humbayer wrote, "The ancient custom of apostolic times is such that, in circumstances hard for the faith, those to whom God's word is entrusted gather to take a Christian decision. Often bishops from the whole of Europe came together. For instance, the capituli in Basel between 1521 and 1523 were attended by brethren from Switzerland, Flanders, Belgium, Saxony, Heinrich von Eppendorf, Franconia, Stumpf, Frankfurt am Main, the Knight Hartmut von Kronberg, Holland, Rode, England, Richard Krock, Thomas Lipset, and other places. At the Augsburg Synod of 1526, more than 60 elder brethren were present. The social views of the Anabaptists were not uniform throughout. The chronicle by Sebastian Frank, from the 16th century, says about them, "Some believe themselves to be holy and pure. They have everything in common. Others practice communality only to the extent that they do not permit need to arise among themselves. Among them a sect appeared which wished to make wives, as well as belongings, communal. There is much data on Anabaptists to be found in the book by Bullinger, also written in the 16th century. In describing the sect of Free Brethren that appeared in the vicinity of Zurich, he writes, "The Free Brethren, whom many Anabaptists called crude brethren, were quite widespread in the early days of the movement. They understood Christian freedom in a carnal sense. For they wished to be free of all laws, presuming that Christ had liberated them. Therefore, they regarded themselves as free of tithe, of the corvée and of serfdom. Some of them, desperate libertines, seduced silly women into believing that they could not become spiritual without breaking wedlock. Others believed that if all things must be in common, then also wives. Still others said that after the new baptism they had been born anew and could not sin, only flesh sins. These false teachings were the source of shame and obscenity. And yet they dared to teach that such was the will of the Father." Elsewhere Bullinger reports, "And they say in earnest that no one should have property and that all wealth and patrimony should be in common, as it is impossible to be Christian and wealthy at the same time. They set forth as a new monastic order rules regarding clothing as to the fabric, shape, and style, length and size. They set forth rules as to eating, drinking, sleeping, leisure, standing and walking about." In the early 1520s, the Anabaptists renounced the conspiratorial character of their activities and entered into an open struggle with the world and the Catholic Church. In 1524, a large-scale secret conference was held in Nuremberg and attended by Dunk, one of the most influential Anabaptist writers, by the Picard Hetzer, by Hud of the Old Waldensian Brethren, and by other brethren. Many were seized, but Dunk fled to Switzerland. Here a new assembly of brethren from various countries took place. It was decided to begin to practice the second baptism openly. This decision was put into effect in Zurich and St. Gall. This was apparently symbolic of the shift to outright struggle, precisely the course taken by the Czech brethren in the village of Lota, in 1457, when they decided to demonstrate openly their split with Catholicism. In St. Gall in 1525, a uniform of coarse grey fabric and a broad grey hat were introduced as obligatory for all members of the community. All forms of participation in public life and entertainment were forbidden. Anabaptists were called monks without hoods. The leaders of the Anabaptist community in Zurich preached that all property must be held in common and together. These events were accompanied by strange happenings. Members of some of the groups went naked at their gatherings and, to be like children, crept around on the ground, playing. Others burned the Bible, and with shouts of "Here! Here!" beat themselves on the breast to show the place where the life-giving Spirit dwells. One of them, on orders from his father, killed his brother in imitation of Christ's sacrifice. The Anabaptists did not succeed in taking control of the Reformation movement in Switzerland, thanks in large part to Zwingli's opposition to them. Exiled Swiss Anabaptists fled to Bohemia and joined the Bohemian Brethren there. Large combined communities were founded on collectivist principles. Communal property was introduced. Everything earned by the Brethren was handed over to the common treasury, which was supervised by a special distributor. The good police controlled the whole of the life of the community: clothing, lodging, upbringing of children, marriage and work. The type of men's and women's clothing, the hour for going to bed, the time for work and rest were all strictly prescribed. The life of the Brethren took place before the eyes of others. It was forbidden to cook anything for oneself. Meals had to be taken in common. The unmarried slept in common bedrooms, men and women separately. Children, from the age of 2, were separated from their parents and brought up in common children's houses. Marriages were arranged by the elders. They also assigned to everyone his or her occupation. Members of the community refused to have any contact with the state. They did not serve in the army, never went to court. They did, however, retain a passively hostile attitude while rejecting violence of any kind. In Germany, Anabaptism began to take on an increasingly revolutionary character. In Thuringia, near the Bohemian border, the city of Zwickau became the center of the movement. The so-called Zwickau prophets, headed by the Anabaptist apostle Klaus Storch, believed that the elect of the Lord could communicate with him directly, as the apostles of old could, and denied that the church was capable of giving salvation. Their teaching considered science and the arts unnecessary for man, for everything essential to his salvation was already given to him by God. In imitation of Christ, Storch surrounded himself with 12 apostles and 70 disciples. The prophets predicted an invasion by the Turks, the reign of the Antichrist, destruction of the impious, and finally the arrival of the 1,000-year kingdom of God, when there would be one baptism and one faith. An exposition of Storch's teachings has been preserved in a work by Wagner published in the late 16th century in Erfurt. It is titled How Niklas Storch Instigated Sedition in Thuringia and the Neighboring Regions, and was written on the basis of eyewitness accounts. It cites the following points of his doctrine. 1. That no matrimonial union, whether secret or open, should be observed. 3. That on the contrary, each may take wives whenever his flesh demands it and his passion rises, and may live with them in intimacy at his will. 4. That everything ought to be held in common, for God has sent all men equally naked into the world. And likewise, he has given them equally everything that is on the earth, the birds of the air and the fish of the water. 5. Therefore it ought to be that all authorities, secular and clerical, be deprived of their offices once and for all, or killed by the sword, for they alone live as they will and suck the blood and sweat of the poor, glutting themselves and drinking day and night. Quote, hence everyone must rise up, the sooner the better, arm himself and attack the priests in their cozy nests, massacre and exterminate them. For once the sheep are deprived of a leader, it will go easy with the sheep. Next it will be necessary to attack also those who fleece others, to seize their houses, plunder their property, and raze their castles to the ground. End quote. This first surge of the Anabaptist movement coincided with the 1525 Peasant War in Germany. The socialist teachings of the time are most vividly mirrored in the activity of Thomas Müntzer. His biography is presented at greater length in the appendix. We shall therefore limit ourselves to a brief comment on his doctrine here. Müntzer taught that the only Lord and King of the earth is Christ. He assigned to princes a function very like that of hangman, and even this prerogative was to be exercised only on direct orders from the elect of the Lord. If the princes refused to obey, they were to be executed. The authority of Christ was seen as truly embodied in the society of the elect, a narrow union sharply separated from the rest of the population. Müntzer did indeed attempt to organize such a union. He seized power in the town of Mühlhausen, where rebellious inhabitants had driven out the municipal council. In the city and the surrounding area, monasteries were laid waste, sacred images destroyed, monks and priests killed. Müntzer taught that all property was to be held in common. An identical demand was part of the program of his union. A chronicle written at the time relates that a practical attempt at implementing these principles was undertaken at Mühlhausen. However, an army gathered by the local princes soon approached the town. Müntzer and his followers were overwhelmingly defeated. He was executed. The Anabaptists' participation in the Peasant War called forth the particular ire of the authorities. A violent and extremely cruel wave of persecution of Anabaptists swept across South and Central Germany. This temporarily weakened militant and socialist sentiments, but around 1530 they surfaced again. In his chronicle, Sebastian Frank reports that about 1530, in Switzerland, brethren who believed in the possibility of self-defense and war under certain circumstances began to gain the upper hand in the organization. Such brethren were in the majority. At the Anabaptist synods, the influence of the more moderate apostoldom waned, while a former associate of Müntzer's, Hutt, who preached complete communality of worldly goods, came to the forefront. He proclaimed, "The saints must be joyful and must take up double-edged swords in order to wreak vengeance in the nations." Hutt created a new union whose goal was slaughter of all overlords and powers that be. He also proposed establishing the rule of Hanshut on earth and making Mulhausen the capital. A majority of the members of the Union knew nothing of his radical plans. Only a narrow circle of members, called the knowers, was initiated into these secrets. In 1535, councillors to Emperor Charles V submitted a report stating that Anabaptists, who call themselves true Christians, wish to divide all property. The increasingly explosive situation found expression in some preposterous incidents which were, however, destined to be outstripped by later events. For example, the Furrier Augustin Bader proclaimed himself king of the new Israel and made himself a crown and kingly garments. He was tried in Stuttgart. In 1534 and 1535, this rise of Anabaptist militancy led to an outbreak of violence which can be seen as an attempt to bring about an Anabaptist revolution in Northern Europe. The main events were played out in northern Germany. Anabaptists had gravitated there earlier, having been driven out of southern and central Germany. The town of Munster became the center of these events. Taking advantage of the struggle going on between Catholics and Lutherans, the Anabaptists gained control in the municipal council and then completely subjugated the town. All who refused to accept a second baptism were expelled after being stripped of their possessions. Thereafter all property in the city was appropriated for the common lot, everyone being obliged to deliver his possessions under the supervision of special deacons. Next, polygamy was introduced, and women of a certain age were forbidden to stay unmarried. Anabaptist apostles fanned out from Munster across Germany, Denmark, and Holland, preaching the second baptism and calling the faithful to come to the aid of the city. Revolt gripped a number of towns, and Anabaptists gathered by land and by sea to support Munster. Terrified by developments, Bishop Waldeck, whose diocese included Munster, called up an army together with the neighboring princes and surrounded the town. The siege lasted for over a year. Within the town in the meantime, one of the Anabaptists, Jan Bokelson, also called Johann of Leyden, was proclaimed the king of Munster and of the whole world. He surrounded himself with a luxurious court and a multitude of wives, and he personally beheaded recalcitrants in the town square. At the same time, uprisings of Anabaptists broke out all over northern Germany and in Holland, where they even succeeded in seizing the Amsterdam town hall for a short time. The authorities finally began to regain control. In 1535, Munster was taken by assault and Bokelson and other Anabaptist leaders were executed. A more detailed description of this episode is given in the appendix.